Restoration Ecology midterm, Vanessa Patch. What is restoration ecology? Restoration ecology is aiding an ecosystem in returning to a more appropriate natural state previous to the ecosystem's current damage, degraded, or destroyed state. Sizes range from landscape size, which is, for example, the entire South Florida ecosystem, to a single city lot, example, urban restorations. Scope is transdisciplinary, from severe degradation to natural remnants, and it can be relatively cheap or very expensive, upwards of $1 million. Types include severely degraded sites, for example, old minefields, remnants of historical natural communities that have been isolated from natural disturbance. The when and why of restoration ecology. Why is restoration ecology needed? It's needed because severe degradation in natural communities is a worldwide problem. It affects all ecosystem types. When the ecosystem is degraded or lost, it can no longer provide the ecosystem services it used to for human communities. Restoration looks to fix this. It was defined as a field in the 1980s when Society for Ecological Restoration was created. A definition of restoration ecology was not agreed upon until 2004. Arguments against restoring ecosystems include natural succession and disturbance, viability of restored ecosystem in today's climate, and the expense of a restoration project. There are 3 types of restoration. Complete, which includes all attributes of historic natural communities. An example of this is the Nachusa Grassland Project case study. Ecological services, which is process-based structural or functional restorations, simplified array of native species, and may result in novel communities. Example of this is restoring wetlands for carbon storage in the Bavarian Alps case study, and experiential, which is created to provide pleasure for people. The example is Presidio in San Francisco case study. Novel communities are a community that has groups of species with no counterpart in nature, site conditions altered by human disturbance to the point where there is no natural analog, and only natives community restoration would be impractical. Where novel communities are found is old industrial sites, mine tailings deposits, abandoned urban areas, and ecological services restoration sites. Purpose and goal of elements of a restoration plan include a purpose and goal, which is working with everyone involved in a restoration to decide what the site will look like in the future and what should the complete restoration look like, and who will use the site and how. For example, are hunting, hiking, biking, etc. allowed? Background information on a site, conduct site inventory research, other restorations in the area and their success, a vision and plan. Where will you alter the ecosystem? What techniques will be used? What will it cost? What type of labor is needed? What is the timeline for the restoration? And post-restoration monitoring and management. Which objectives were met? Documenting what worked and what didn't work, what continued management may be needed. Determining restoration success. Restoration success is determined by how well the completed restoration meets goals initially set out in the project. Contains characteristic assemblage of the species that are found in the reference ecosystem and that provide appropriate community structure. Consists of indigenous species to the greatest practicable extent. Is in restored cultural ecosystems. Allowances can be made for exotic domesticated species and for non-invasive ruderal and sagittal species that presumably co-evolved with them. All functional groups necessary for continued development and or stability of restored ecosystem are represented, or if they are not, the missing groups have the potential to colonize by natural means. The physical environment of the restored ecosystem is capable of sustaining reproducing populations of the species necessary for its continued stability or development on a long desired trajectory. Restored ecosystem apparently functions normally for its ecological stage of development, and signs of dysfunction are absent. The restored ecosystem is suitably integrated into a larger ecological matrix or landscape, which it interacts with through abiotic and biotic flows and exchanges. Potential threats to the health and integrity of the restored ecosystem from the surrounding landscape have been eliminated or reduced as much as possible. The restored ecosystem is sufficiently resilient to endure normal periodic stress events in the local environment that serve to maintain the integrity of the ecosystem. The restored ecosystem is self-sustaining to the same degree as its reference ecosystem and has the potential to persist indefinitely under existing environmental conditions. Nevertheless, aspects of its biodiversity, structure, and functioning may change as part of normal ecosystem development and may fluctuate in response to normal periodic stress and occasional disturbance events of greater consequences. In any intact ecosystem, the species composition and other attributes of a restored ecosystem may evolve as environmental conditions change. 7 challenges of restoration include change, we didn't know everything, record keeping, danger of mitigation, unique site history, conflict among users, and resources. Opportunities provided by restoration include enlarging preserves, habitat links, land bridges, restoring remnants and processes, education and knowledge gain, and increasing community capacity. Examples of restoration projects are a landscape scale example is the Malpai Borderlands Group. The location is along the borders of Mexico, southeastern Arizona, southwestern New Mexico, and it's a fire-dependent grasslands and savannas. And the Malpai Borderlands Group did this. The goal is to preserve fire-dependent grasslands and savannas, and problems where without regular fire, the landscape was converted to a more of a shrub community. Techniques used were implementing prescribed burns. Small-scale restoration example is the Alfred Caldwell Lily Pool. Location is Lily Pool Pond in Lincoln Park, Chicago, Illinois. The ecosystem was a public park. The Chicago Parks District and Friends Organization did the restoration, and the goal was to restore the site to the previous state of the Caldwell restoration. Problem was that the site was deteriorated, exotics had taken over, eroded soils, crumbled stonework, and the lagoon was silted. Techniques were pest removal, native plantings, and path repair and redesign. Restoration with an experiment example is a demonstration of field trial erosion control case study. Location was Lakeshore Nature Preserve in UW-Madison campus. Ecosystem was wooded hillsides, and who did it was the project assistant Rebecca Cagle. The goal was maintaining a herbaceous ground layer throughout the woods, and the problem was wooded hillsides are largely devoid of vegetation due to erosion from runoff and foot traffic. The technique used was to test 2 erosion control techniques over 2 years and implement the treatment that worked best. Restoration with volunteers, the Presidio San Francisco case study. The location was the Presidio in San Francisco. The ecosystem was redwood, shorelines, and rare endangered species. Who was the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy, and the goal was to protect natural resources and provide for public enjoyment. Problem was to prevent damage from recreational site use, and the techniques used were well-developed volunteer programs to implement habitat restoration and monitoring. Introduction to ecological communities. An ecological community is a group of interacting species living together in the same place at the same time. And how to organize ecosystem in space are environmental gradients, ability to reach a site, species interactions, and essential relationships. Ecological community dynamics are how ecological communities vary through time. Drivers of change in ecosystems over time include disturbances, example, fire, flood, lack of fire, or lack of flood. Organisms from previous communities at the site, example, lichen on a rock. How disturbance cycles interact with community dynamics to create various types of ecosystem. Disturbance can hold a community in an early successional state, example, fire, flood, or have it progress to a later state, example, absence of fire or flood. Disturbance is not always even across a landscape, and a mosaic of different ecosystems is created in this situation, which promotes maximum biodiversity. Intermediate disturbance hypothesis indicates that species diversity at its highest in intermediate frequencies or intensities of disturbance. What is necessary to hold an ecosystem in a successional state is that natural disturbances can keep an ecosystem in a certain successional state for a longer periods of time. Example, prescribed burns and longleaf pine forests. An example of a keystone species is prairie dogs. Their habitat is grasslands of central and western North America, and they support predators such as eagles and coyotes and black-footed ferret. They aerate the soil, which promotes vegetation, and they burrow, which other species such as snakes use. What is an ecosystem? Is all the living and dead organisms in an area together with the atmosphere, hydrosphere, lithosphere, and their interactions. Energy flow in an ecosystem is energy enters in sunlight, it moves through the trophic levels, and some energy is lost in the form of heat at each trophic level. Some species retain energy in their biomass for a long period of time, energetic limits to the number of trophic levels possible, and then it leaves in the form of heat. Biogeochemical cycles describe the reciprocal transfers of chemicals, example, nutrients between the ecosystem components, which includes the biota, atmosphere, lithosphere, and hydrosphere. This includes source pools, sinks, residence time, size, which are local, regional, and global. An example of a biogeochemical cycle is a hydrological cycle. Precipitation, rains, or snow comes down to the earth. It gets absorbed by plants or large bodies of water or goes into the soil. If it goes into the soil, it becomes groundwater. And if it's in plants, it transpires and goes back to the atmosphere. It also evaporates from large bodies of water. If it comes down as snow, it can become snowmelt and run off down into large bodies of water. Once it evaporates, it condensates, and the process starts again. Patches are small areas distinct in a form of composition from the surroundings. Ideal patch geometry is large patches with more interior habitat because up to a point, larger patches support more diversity and are less affected by edge effects. Ideal patch location is near other natural communities, and it has high connectivity to other natural areas because isolated patches can lead to genetic inbreeding. Reasons to use reference ecosystems include starting point for a restoration project, baseline for setting goals, setting up an initial framework to follow. Reasons for reference ecosystems can be limiting and detrimental, forcing a restoration to match the reference ecosystem to negatively affect the environment. It can be costly, and goals of the project may not be met if the reference ecosystem is followed too closely. Importance of project documentation is help guides current and future restorations, help understand conditions at the beginning of a project and what procedures you use to restore to the current condition, helps make adaptive restoration easier. Documentation methods include notes, work journal, team report, photographs, and keep receipts. 3 main ways research should be incorporated into restoration. Set up an experiment or field trial. For example, a greenhouse which grows plants and alters soil pH. Observe contemporary remnants, which is site visits, where you take solid observation, species inventory, slope, etc. Investigate historical communities, for example, historical records, old maps, land surveys, and oral histories. Catesby saw the land in the context of how it can be used to benefit humans. He discussed draining marshes and the agricultural potential of different soils in Carolina. In reading Catesby's writing, it's easy to see the importance of restoration. Catesby describes many unique historical ecological communities that were present in the Southeast that are no longer present or as prevalent. Today, many historical communities have been replaced by oak hickory forest restoration as an attempt to return some of these destroyed and degraded ecological communities to their former historical sites. In the South, specifically, goals and objectives of restoration products in longleaf pine ecosystems have been to preserve the current sites and restore other sites to longleaf pine ecosystem. When conducting a site inventory, 3 categories of data you need to collect include physiogeographic information, for example, location, soils, landforms, and hydrology, biological resources, vegetation, and wildlife, socioeconomic information, example, human pop demographics, zoning regulations, historic land uses, importance to planning or restoration, climate information on precipitation, wet temperature, wind, frequency of extreme events is important because it helps plan for which vegetation and animal communities can be supported regionally and locally. Topography, information on slope, steepness, slope aspect, and elevation is important because it influences local climate, soil properties, hydrology, vegetation composition, and structure, and wind and water disturbance. Hydrology, information on water origin, surface water, and surface permeability is important because it influences plant and animal communities, site preparation, planting methods, and timing and management techniques. Soils information on soils texture, porosity, drainage, depth, etc. is important because it affects the type of plant and animal communities that are suitable on the site. How to learn these factors without a site visit: NOAA, NASA, U.S. Army Corps, CSS, USGS, NRCS, and Web Soil Survey websites. Biological data is important to restoration because, for example, fauna, species composition, migration tendencies, habitat needs, population data, troublesome species, vegetation, compositions and structure of current site using landscape cover pattern, community type lists, vegetation age, and stem densities. These help determine current successional stage. Sociodemographic data is important to restoration because it includes regulations and permits needed to do a restoration. Former site use, for example, agriculture and timber. For future development of the site, current and potential uses of the site and its adjacent land. Existing infrastructure, example, buildings, dams, etc., and access to the site. Importance to restoration. History is important to restoration because it can inform you of past site use that can explain current and condition of the site, can inform you of former ecological communities present on a site, has information on past climate, hydrology, topography, and soil conditions, has information on management practices previously used on the site. The Forest Service initially assumed that fires were harmful to the forests in the Southeast. The Forest Service talked about the rednecks who kept burning the woods but didn't listen to what they said about fire being beneficial and that their families had burned forests for generations. Today, prescribed burns are a common management technique throughout the Southeast. To avoid mistakes like this in my natural resources career, it would be beneficial to talk to native local peoples about their historical management practices. Traditional management methods should always be looked into in addition to methods determined by modern science. Common human impacts of restoration are user impacts and cross-boundary. User impacts include soil compaction, erosion, off-trail impacts, and litter. Cross-boundary is off-site activity that impacts restoration, for example, air pollution, noise pollution, etc. Planning for human impacts. Minimize site access during certain seasons. Minimize activities allowed at the site, example, banning horses or bikes, limiting the number of visitors, building fences and setting marked trails, placing signs. Adaptive management is scientists working with practitioners as they define the problem, create goals, and develop models to help predict outcomes from proposed action. Then as a team, actions are selected and if possible, only do a pilot small-scale test of those actions. Then implement the actions in a large scale in the restoration and monitor the outcomes of those actions. Monitoring plans are necessary in order to collect data to gauge the success of restoration actions. Analyze and evaluate monitoring data to then communicate to how the action worked and adapt current and future approaches based on this knowledge. This process then starts over at the beginning. How does it fill the gap between scientists and restoration practitioners? Partnership between practitioners and scientists and documentation occurs so others can learn about the advancement. Engaging volunteers. A friends group for the site usually require dues and usually dedicated volunteers. Writing, publishing a newsletter or website, art project, building relationships in the community and social media. Best practices for working with volunteers include communication that speaks to people's minds, outreach that affects people's hearts, education that changes people's behavior, match volunteer skills and interests with their job on the project, provide free food and meals, and respect volunteer opinions. How Indigenous and local peoples help with the ecosystem management and restoration. Knowledge about how land was historically used to manage traditional conservation and management techniques, knowledge of former ecosystem compositions, through culture and hunting can fund restoration through taxes. Rednecks in the Southeast in U.S. in burning woods, for an example. Legislation that frequently impacts restoration. River and Harbors Appropriation Act of 1899 gives U.S. Army Corps permission to regulate fill. Clean Water Act of 1972 led the groundwork for mitigation banks, regulate church and fill of navigable waters, requires 4 or 4 permits that might affect navigable waters, and sets the standard for no net loss of wetlands. Endangered Species Act of 1973 has the potential to prompt or limit restoration. 3 steps to follow for placement. Avoid impacts to current wetlands, streams, and other aquatic resources by developing sites where they aren't present. If you cannot avoid impacts, then you should minimize and reduce the impact you have to make to the greatest extent possible. Leaving buffers intact, not altering hydrology, use low impact landscape and forest pavement, prioritize sustainable development options. If impacting the site is necessary, you must then mitigate for impacts that still occur, offset residual impacts. A mitigation bank is a site where resources are restored, enhanced, and/or preserved for the purpose of providing compensatory mitigation for authorized impacts. Options for mitigating impacts or restore previous existing wetland and other aquatic site, enhance an existing aquatic site's function, establishment of a new aquatic site, preserve an existing aquatic site. Determining the amount of mitigation for an environmental impact. Are there different types? Loss type, 3 types, with A needing the highest amount of mitigation credits and type C needing the least. Priority category, primary priority includes state and federal lands and other rare or special areas. Secondary priority includes vulnerable or uncommon aquatic systems. Tertiary priority is the least credits and important, but not rare or valuable systems. Existing condition, how disturbance to the site already in relation to its physical, chemical, and biological functions ranges from fully functional to very impaired. Duration, the length of time that the adverse effects are expected to last. Dominant impact, what impact do you have on planning to the site? Example, clearing and draining. Cumulative impact, the amount of impact of a development or impacts occurring in an area. Options to offset impacts, buy required amount of mitigation credits from mitigation bank in the area with similar ecosystems. Locate a nearby area needing a restoration and determine what you need to do to get the required amount of mitigation credits. Credits will be determined by a proposed wetland mitigation credit worksheet. Factors that determine the amount of mitigation credits generated from a restoration project. Net improvement, how much you propose to improve the system, 0 to 3 scale. Upland buffer, amount of upland buffer plan to include on a 0 to 1 scale. Credit schedule, when a restoration takes place in regards to impact, temporal loss, how long it will take the restored ecosystem to replace the impacted system. Kind, does the restoration occur in the same kind of ecosystem as the impact location? How does it closest restoration to the impact? Based on the virtual field trip at Honeycutt Creek, I do not think that the public shopping center development mitigation was a success. This is because the restoration could have been a more beneficial. It was at the headwaters of Honeycutt Creek. The existing wetland type did not match the target wetland type. The current wetland was too wet to support the target wetland type. Outlets for the wetland at Honeycutt Creek are eroding because they don't have support, and pollution of the creek from upstream, it was not addressed in the restoration plan.